fast forward, here we are. You've written this incredible book, and tell us that little story that you were telling us before about, you know, the moment on television, etc. I mean, because it's not real until it's TV.
Well, when I got into this, when I started looking at data, as opposed to, you know, the mountain thing was just stupidity. But when I started looking at data was on the occasion of the JPL unmanned Viking probes in 1976, where I was, again, a representative of CBS News at JPL for that incredible, unbelievable Viking summer. That's what we call it, the Viking summer. When this nation, on the bicentennial year, sent 2 unmanned spacecraft to land on Mars for the first time, and 2 more to orbit, you know, taking hundreds of thousands of pictures. And it launched the official investigation of the possibility of life on Mars. Well, somewhat after this process began, somewhere around the 25th, I think, of July, one of the key guys in the Viking mission, his name was Dr. Jerry Soffen, stood up in front of us in the JPL. Now, we're now in California, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which I think you have more than a passing knowledge of. And Soffen stood up and he, on the screen, projected kind of like this, a picture showing the face on Mars. That quirky thing with the little black specks on it, you know, with a kind of a snarled lip that has been in every book everywhere on the planet over the last 30 or so years. And he pointed to it and he said, you know, isn't it funny what tricks of light and shadow can do? Big laugh from all us assembled press people. When we took a picture a few hours later, it all went away. It was just a trick of light and shadow. So I'm there. I'm another witness to this statement, to this process. Fast forward the film. I get into the process of actually looking at this picture decades later, in the 1980s, in the late 80s, around 89. And I find that everything that Soffen told us also was a lie. It wasn't a trick of light and shadow. When you do the actual computer processing, it's a stunningly symmetrical statue, 1.5 miles long and half a mile high, and we've had umpteen images now. We've had other independent, you know, computerized enhancements of the various data. There's 3D modeling, there's stereo, there's shape from shading, there's all kinds of analysis, all of it, by the way, performed by us outside NASA. NASA has ignored and simply told everybody it's just nonsense, go away, go away. Gosh, NASA says that, amazing. But the key moment was, and when I discovered, when I went back through the timeline, is that Jerry's statement, and I can call him Jerry because I knew him pretty well, was also a lie. There was no picture taken of the face on Mars a few hours later. Technically, a few hours later, as Mars rotated and the orbit of the Viking camera changed, that region of Mars was in darkness. They couldn't take a picture. The next opportunity to take a picture was 1 month later, actually 35 days. And the picture was taken, which is unusual because at that time in the mission they hardly ever took 2 pictures of the same piece of real estate. And they had to wait a month to come back in the geometry and take the second picture, which of course, if you look at it from the outside, somebody was checking that if it was the same thing there on the second frame at a different sun angle, science says it's probably real. It probably was a real face. It was a real statue. It was a real enigma, a real incredible breakthrough in what NASA and Viking claimed they were searching for, life on Mars. Except, of course, they lied to us. They lied to us. They lied to us. And they've been lying on this subject for 30 years. That's what got me into asking, is it really that they're lying, or are they just fools? Are they scientists who have no conception of how real science should operate, which is that when you see something so stunningly in the middle of your paradigm, you have a mission, you have a whole taxpayer-funded mission, billions of dollars spent looking for life on Mars. Well, a mile-wide statue kind of is life. It's built by somebody, maybe. So isn't the scientific method to check it out? No, instead of checking it out, they ran at warp 9 in the other direction.
Okay, but if they were lying back then, and that was one of the first missions to Mars.
It was the first landing and orbital mission.
Then they must have been prepared to lie. I mean, isn't that the supposition? they knew what they were going to find? Is this where the secret space program was already in operation prior to this mission?
Okay, this now gets a little technical. Viking was not the first mission to Mars. The first was Mariner 4 in 1965. The second was Mariner 6 and 7 that occurred during the Apollo summer when I was covering the first manned landings on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And we went from North American Rockwell, where we had built a whole studio complex, including a walk-through solar system, which was my idea. And we went up the street, up the hill to JPL to finish covering the Apollo return, because they were about halfway between Earth and Moon. And we had to also cover the Mariner 6 flyby and 7 flyby of Mars, the second unmanned missions. And then the third unmanned mission that was sent to Mars by this country, by the United States, was in 1971. It was called Mariner 9. But as opposed to being a flyby, where you basically take a few shots as you go away forever, it was the first U.S. spacecraft to go into orbit around Mars. And it radically transformed all our thinking. So as I reconstruct history, I'm looking at the Viking images of Cydonia, of the face on Mars, and I'm saying that there have to exist somewhere. We have not found them. They're not in any public file. There have to exist secret images taken by Mariner 9 in 1971. Because Viking was 76, you've got 72, 73, 74, 75, 5 years to have predetermined there was something really interesting down there on the plains of Cydonia.
Okay.
So when we put Viking into orbit, they knew exactly where to take the new, much better pictures.
Was it discussed as a possibility that the Viking lander would actually land in Cydonia, but then it was dismissed as being too rocky? Have I remembered?
Yes, you are remembering that exactly correct. The first landing site was in something called the Plains of Gold, Chrysi Planitia in Latin. And the second landing site, they were talking about landing in Cydonia. Now, before everybody gets their hearts aflutter, you got to keep in mind, this is like talking about landing in North America or landing in Albuquerque in my backyard. Cydonia is a big place, Mr. Scott, quoting from Star Trek. So even if they had planned to land in Cydonia, the odds are we would have been nowhere near the interesting stuff where the face and the city and all that other complex is located. No, what's interesting to me politically is that after the initial announcement that they were going to land in Cydonia, after the first pictures were taken by the Viking 1 orbiter, the trajectory of the second spacecraft coming along behind, not even put into orbit around Mars yet, was changed. So they would land in a completely different place. So it's like whoever was doing the programming didn't want even the possibility that they might land by accident in Cydonia and see this stuff up close.
Okay, so I'm assuming that you're talking about ruins that they knew about, they had prior knowledge. And you're saying they had prior knowledge because they had another space program. That's
one level of the prior knowledge.
Right.
That we can prove.
Okay.
Unquestionably we can prove, except we haven't found the missing Mariner 9 images. We found Mariner 9 images of other interesting things that were discussed. Sagan and Cosmos talked about the pyramids of Elysium. They're these huge, several mile wide tetrahedral pyramids located halfway around the planet from Cydonia. And in one of Carl Sagan's books, he actually relates them in an interesting metaphorical passage to each other. And I don't remember the details, but I thought it was strikingly intriguing, both at the time and in hindsight, that Carl would connect those dots. But that's the only pretty hard data we have. We know we had a spacecraft on station, Mariner 9. We know we had another spacecraft come along 5 years later, Viking. It's logical to assume if we had really good shots, perfectly framed, of the face on Mars and the pyramids from Viking, that they could have had prior knowledge from the lower resolution images from Mariner 9. That's not a stretch. That's not a leap at all. What I think gets really interesting is when you begin to ask the question, is it possible they knew there was something there to photograph at all from a long, long time ago in a history far, far away? And that gets back to the three groups running NASA inside: the Nazis, the Masons, and the magicians.
Okay.
Because two of those groups, the Nazis and the Masons, we know had textual evidence, ancient documents, stuff, text